I want you all to know that whatever and whenever these proceedings generate, it is something that has never been done before to tell the story of the African American and certainly the African American politician. For those of us who have sacrificed our families, our professions, and even our lives to help bring about a better way of life in America.
So you are now a representative in what state? In Mississippi. Well, I don't know how you feel about all this story.
Fourth case I submit to you, panelists, will be an essay on prosecutorial misconduct. And I think it's bound to become one of the most egregious cases in the harassment and abuse of a black elected official in the history of the United States Justice Department.
And that until we remove from our system of government a rotten, permanent bureaucracy which acts like contract assassins, using the authority of the justice system to perpetrate assassination, this country is not free, nor anyone in it.
Good that it was brought up. I mean, we can see that in this case, in the case of Demjanjuk, the KGB people were much fairer than the Justice Department. Really, because, and I'll tell you why.
Are you saying to us that one government, the United States, declared the president, the head of state of another government, to be a war criminal, and the second government, through official sources, asked the United States government for clarification and the basis on which it reached that conclusion, and the United States government refused to provide that information?
On August 31st and September 1st, 1995, a distinguished panel of American legislators and international observers held extraordinary hearings to investigate the Justice Department's politically motivated and illegal targeting of groups and individuals. The panel included Representative William Clark of Alabama, Representative Toby Fitch of North Carolina, Senator Robert Ford of South Carolina, Senator Maggie Wallace Glover of South Carolina, Monsignor Elias L. Hayek of Montreal, Representative John Hilliard of Alabama, Representative Howard Hunter of North Carolina, Representative Ulysses Jones Jr. of Tennessee, and Representative Percy Watson of Mississippi. The hearings were observed by Dr. Kofi Awanor, former ambassador to the United Nations of the Republic of Ghana, Marino El Savif of the Dominican Republic, Dr. Josef Mikloshko, former vice premier of the Republic of Czechoslovakia, and noted civil rights leader Amelia Boynton Robinson. The first day's sessions were largely devoted to one of the ugliest stories in U.S. judicial history, the campaign to harass, entrap, and prosecute every African-American elected official in America. This was followed by the case of Lyndon LaRouche, often referred to as the American Dreyfus, which included testimony from attorney Odin Anderson, LaRouche himself, and former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark. The Demjanjuk case was detailed by his Israeli attorney, Yoram Sheftel, who risked his own life to save his client from the hangman. And Dr. Hans Köchler, president of the International Progress Organization, described how former UN General Secretary Kurt Waldheim, when he became president of Austria, also became a target of a corrupt unit within the U.S. Department of Justice. The hearings were chaired by former South Carolina Congressman James Mann and by Alabama's most renowned civil rights attorney, J.L. Chestnut.
This is an independent panel of my distinguished colleagues from all over this country who have come to this place at this time to investigate allegations of misconduct by the United States Department of Justice generally, and in particular their targeting of black elected officials.
As we attempt to study the broad subject of misconduct by the Department of Justice, and we look at Ruby Ridge, and we look at Waco, and we look at Demoniac, and others of lesser notoriety, we cannot overlook the one that is perhaps the most pervasive, and I'm stealing the word from Ramsey Clark, I think, most pervasive course of misconduct by the Department of Justice in the history of this country. Broader based, long-standing, abuse of power beyond expression. Abuse of power through the use of federal agencies, including even the bankruptcy court. Throughout the days of the LaRouche ordeal, Odin Anderson, a lawyer from Boston, has been the solid rock of criminal defense and counsel, far and above any other person. He can therefore speak to the subject of misconduct or such facets of that as he may choose to discuss better than anybody. And we appreciate him taking the time to be here from Boston to make some such statement as he wishes to make and be responsive to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman, honorable panel. It's I who thank you for this opportunity to speak about the LaRouche case. Probably the best way to demonstrate the government's venal behavior and the unconstitutional activities undertaken directed out of the criminal division of the Department of Justice is to show you their own documents and read to you their own words. And by way of history, I'd like to have the screen. You see before you is an FBI memorandum from the SAC, who is the special agent in charge of the New York field office of the FBI, to the director regarding, and the name subject, Lyndon Hermile LaRouche Jr., also known as Lynn Marcus, as they suggest. This is the most incredible piece of FBI material, one of the most incredible pieces of FBI material that I've ever seen. And CPUSA, we're Communist Party. I'm going to get it. That's the Communist Party of the United States. What this suggests is that the Communist Party has let the FBI know that they want to eliminate Lyndon LaRouche for their political reasons. They consider him to be a politically dangerous person, and the Communist Party wants to eliminate him. If you look at the bottom, New York proposes submitting a blind memorandum to the Daily World to foster these efforts. Here's the FBI climbing in bed with the Communist Party in order to effect the elimination of Lyndon LaRouche from the political scene. I think we all know what that means. So moving into the 80s, Henry Kissinger, who we all know by name and some probably remember by reputation and actions, was a very powerful man. Mr. LaRouche took exception with his policies, which he considered to be genocidal, got into a serious row with Mr. Kissinger. And Mr. Kissinger writes to William Webster, the director of the FBI. They had recently had a lovely social occasion together at a place called the Grove, where these powers associate and frolic around in various curious ways. And after that, he thanks, he appreciates having seen him there, and asks for the assistance of Bill Webster in dealing with the LaRouche menace. In all of these documents, if you'd like to see them, I'm trying to rush a little bit because I know we're all behind, and Mr. LaRouche and Mrs. LaRouche are both here, and I'd rather have you hear from them than me. So here is, within the short period thereafter, Buck Revell, who was the head of counterintelligence for the FBI at the time, is sent this memorandum by William Webster, who was contacted by David Abshire of PIFIAB. That's the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board. And these same parties, Henry Kissinger and his colleagues, are now raising before PIFIAB the question as to whether LaRouche, because he seems to have funding from sources that they don't understand, is possibly operating as a foreign intelligence agent, and they want them to look into this. Now, what that does, and the words are bad enough, but the reality is terrifying. This triggers Executive Order 12333, which allows virtually any form of conduct, any activity, to be undertaken as long as it's under this national security cover. So this was the beginning of a national security covered operation against Mr. LaRouche and his colleagues. I have represented Lyndon LaRouche since 1984, at which time he was directly targeted by the Department of Justice through its U.S. Attorney's Office in Boston. LaRouche and his colleagues were charged with conspiracy, with a few other specific charges linked on as an afterthought. We tried the case for 7 months. We weren't even through with the government's case when the case mistried. The reason it mistried is that the jury had been led to believe that the case would have been over long before, which it would have had we been able to concentrate on the evidence, but because of the hearings that the judge was forced to conduct for literally months and months on governmental misconduct, the case dragged on and the jury sat in the jury box. So the jury ultimately got frustrated and the case mistried. This is an article from the Boston Herald that printed that day, and I'm only showing it to you for one reason, not because of the highlight, LaRouche jury would have voted not guilty, although that's true, and those come out of the words of the jury foreman who was interviewed. But in the first line of text, there are some very important words from the foreman. We would have acquitted everybody at this point, and that's based on prosecution evidence, said Foreman Dashowitz. There was too much question of government misconduct in what was happening to the LaRouche campaign.
I'd followed the earlier case in Boston, which by any measure was an extremely peculiar case, both in its charges, in its prosecution, and in its history. I knew the judge there as a fellow Texan. His brother, Page Keaton, had been dean of the law school where I started out down at the University of Texas. And he's one of the old school that doesn't like tricks, falsity, or injustice, and he became outraged with the prosecution. And did a lot. I can't tell you he did all that a judge could have done. I believe Odin will agree, though, he did a lot. There are not many judges who come through a political conditioning and process who have the courage to stand up to the power of the executive branch, to the FBI and others, and say the things that he did. And that's was almost an early end to a malicious prosecution.
government misconduct. Very seldom do you get a jury to see it because the government fights you nail and tooth. They lie, they cover up evidence, they in fact deny information to their own agents so that the agent won't be in the position to have to intentionally not disclose it. These are common tactics, and that's what happened here. Fortunately, in our case, we were able to show enough of it to the jury so that the jury got the smell. However, the government wasn't about to quit, particularly having taken what was a serious public relations beating at that point in time. So they decided to switch forums, come down to a much more favorable forum, the most favorable forum, the Eastern District of Virginia, the so-called Rocket Docket, the home of almost every government agency and government contractor in the country, with a few other pockets here and there. I missed one piece, which I have to tell you, and I'll do it quickly. Back in Boston, the grand jury that was investigating the case held certain businesses associated with Mr. LaRouche in contempt of court for not producing documents which were under subpoena, which were being fought during a period of time based on various privacy grounds. $20 million worth of contempt sanctions were imposed. The government then sought to collect that $20 million by filing an involuntary bankruptcy against these organizations in Alexandria, Virginia, just prior to not just prior, but some point prior to the Alexandria indictments.
And they come in with a bankruptcy claim, a false bankruptcy claim against nonprofit publishing houses and shut them down. What's the First Amendment worth, you know? We'll silence you. You'll have no books out there. And not only that, then they give they take people who were contributing and supposed to be paid back their loans to the publisher and try to prosecute falsely on it. They put on witnesses to give false testimony. From the tens and tens of thousands of contributors and thousands of people who gave loans, they come up with a baker's dozen, roughly, 13, 14, 15 people who got their feelings hurt, perhaps, and some who were mean-spirited enough to lie about it, and who didn't get their money back, although they were being paid back.
The $20 million the government sought was a ruse. In fact, what they intended to do and what they did do was close the conspiracy that they alleged in the Alexandria indictments on the very day that they filed the bankruptcy. The point of the bankruptcy being that from the moment a bankruptcy is filed, an order issues that no debts may be paid without permission of the, I'm sure I'm going beyond the 15 minutes, I'm feeling a little bit guilty, but no one can pay any debts without order of the court. So it was physically impossible for any debts to be repaid after that, thereby creating a pool of persons who were owed money who couldn't be repaid. They got 5 or 6 of these people to come forward and say I was promised repayment and didn't get it, and that was the basis for the conviction for loan fraud.
Federal prosecutor John Markham later admitted in testimony before the Fourth Circuit Court that without this bankruptcy ruling, the loans in question might have been repaid, thus undermining the whole pretext of the Alexandria case. On April 20th, 1987, the bankruptcy order was signed by federal Judge Albert Bryan. Later, as presiding judge in LaRouche's criminal trial, the same Judge Bryan ruled that all evidence concerning the government's role in the involuntary bankruptcy would be suppressed. 10 months after LaRouche was sent to prison, Federal Judge Martin Bostetter ruled that the government's action had been illegal, committed in objective bad faith, and obtained by a constructive fraud upon the court.
I read the record. In addition to reading books, I read lots of records from trials. Absolutely no evidence to support a conviction there. If you take it all. If you exclude the parts that were false or venomous, there's not even a shell.
I was born in September 1922 in Rochester, New Hampshire, lived there for the first 10 years of my life. lived for the next 22 years of my life in Lynn, Massachusetts, except for service overseas. I moved to New York City, where I lived until July of 1983. And since that time, except for a period of incarceration, I have been a resident of the Commonwealth of Virginia. I attended university a couple of times during the course before the war, or at the beginning of the war and after it, and then had a career in management consulting, which lasted until about 1972, tapered off, sort of. My most notable professional achievement was developed during the years 1948, 1952, in certain discoveries of a fundamental scientific nature in respect to economics. And my professional qualifications are essentially derived from that. In the course of time, in 1954, 64 approximately, I was persuaded that things were being done to change the United States, which, from my view, were the worst possible disaster which could befall this nation. And thus, while I had given up any hope of political improvement of this country before then to speak of, I felt I had to do something. So I became involved part-time from 1966 through 1973 in teaching a course, a one-semester course in economics, largely on the graduate level at a number of campus locations, chiefly in New York City, but also in Pennsylvania. In the course of this, a number of the students who participated in these classes became associated with me. And out of this association came the birth of a nascent political organization, as much a philosophical organization as political. Our essential commitment was third world issues and related issues. That is, that the economic justice for what is called the third world is essential for a just society for all nations. I became particularly attached to this during military service overseas in India, where I saw what colonialism does to people. And I was persuaded at the time, as I believe a majority of the people who were in service with me, was that we were coming to the end of a war which we had not foreseen, for which we had been obliged to fight, and that if we allowed these circumstances to prevail that I saw in the third world, we would bring upon ourselves some kind of disaster, either war or something comparable down the line. And that was essentially our commitment as an association. We became rather unpopular with a number of institutions, including George Bundy's Ford Foundation. About 1969, we made a mess of a few projects he was funding by exposing them. And we also became unpopular with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, perhaps on the behest of McGeorge Bundy. In 1973, there was, according to a document later issued under the Freedom of Information Act by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the New York office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, acting at all times under supervision of Washington headquarters, hatched a plot to have me eliminated or to induce the Communist Party USA that my elimination would solve a number of their problems. There actually was an abortive attempt on me during that period. And later, of course, I knew the FBI had been involved. I couldn't prove it then, but I knew it. And later a document appeared showing that. From that point on, during the 1970s, until the end of COINTELPRO, we were constantly beset by the FBI. Our main weapon against the FBI was jokes. We used to make some jokes about the FBI, which we would pass around to try to persuade them to keep off our tail, but they kept coming, and all kinds of harassment. Then, in 1982, there was a new development. I sensed it happening, but I received the documents later. The events which led to my, what I would call a fraudulently obtained indictment and conviction and incarceration. It started, according to the record, of which I had some sensibility this was going on at the time, of Henry Kissinger, the former Secretary of State, with whom no love was lost between us, went to William Webster and others soliciting an FBI or other government operation against me and my associates. This led, as the record later showed, to a decision by Henry Kissinger's friends on the President's Foreign Intelligence Advisory Board, recommending an operation against me and my associates. The first, this was adopted during the same month of January by Judge Webster, the director of the FBI, who passed the implementation of this instruction along to his subordinate, Oliver Buck Revell, recently retired from the FBI, I believe. And the first inkling I had of this was in about April of 1983, in which time a New York banker, who is very intelligence-witting, shall we say, a private bank of Smith and Train in New York City, held a salon at which various government agents, private individuals, the Anti-Defamation League, for example, and also NBC TV News, the Reader's Digest, the Wall Street Journal, and others were represented. The purpose was to coordinate an array of libels, a menu of libels, which would be commonly used by the news media in an attempt to defame me and hopefully, from their standpoint, to lead to criminal action against me and my associates. In January of 1984, this attack came into the open, launched by NBC TV, which had been a participant in this salon of trains, which launched the pattern, which was the pattern of coverage by all U.S. news media, major news media, and many minor news media, from the period of January, the end of January 1984, through the end of 1988. I saw no case of any significant coverage of me or mention of me in the U.S. print media, particularly the major print media, the Associated Press in particular, which was an active part of the prosecution, in fact, or in the national television media, network media especially. Not a single mention of me which did not conform to the menu of libels concocted by this salon, which had been established under John Train as part of this operation. This salon, including the Anti-Defamation League, NBC TV, others, the Associated Press, actively collaborated, beginning sometime in 1984, with forces inside the government which were determined to have a criminal prosecution against me and my associates. The criminal prosecution was launched in about the time of the election, the 1984 presidential election, in October, November 1984. And from that point on, it was a continued escalation until a federal case in Boston led to a mistrial, occasioned largely by government misconduct in the case, in May of 1988. Following that, in about October, was it 14th or something of that sort, in Virginia, a new prosecution was opened up, and that led to my conviction in December of 1988 and my sentencing for 15 years in 1989. I believe Mr. Anderson has described the nature of the case. And that resulted in 5 years of service in federal prison, of which I'm now released on parole. The motivations of the case against us, I think, are in part obvious, perhaps partly not. In 1982-83, there were two things which greatly excited my enemies. Number one, I had been involved in 1982 in presenting a proposal which is based on my forecast in the spring of 1982 that a major debt crisis would break out in South America, Central America, and the expectation that Mexico would be the nation that would have a debt crisis. I've been involved with many of these countries and personalities in them in projecting alternatives to this kind of inequitable system where colonial nation had been replaced as a term by debtor nation. And the debt of South America, Central America was largely illegitimate, that it was a debt which had not been incurred for value received, but had been done under special monetary conditions under the so-called floating exchange rate system, where somebody would come, bankers would come to a country, the IMF in particular, and say, we just wrote down the value of the currency, we're now going to refund your financing of your foreign debt, which you can no longer pay on the same basis as before. So I propose that the debt crisis be used as the occasion for united action by a number of governments of South and Central American countries to force a reform in the international debt relations and to force a reform within international monetary relations. This report was entitled Operation Juarez, largely because of the relationship of President Lincoln to Mexico during the time that Lincoln was president, with the idea that it was in the interest of the United States to accept and to sponsor such a reform, to assist these countries in the freedom to resume development of the type which they had desired. And this report was published in August of 1982, ironically a few weeks before the eruption of the great Mexico debt crisis of '82, and was presented also to the U.S. government, the National Security Council, for the President's information at that time. There was some effort on the part of the President of Mexico to implement my proposal in the initial period of the debt crisis. He had at that time some support from the President of Brazil and the government of Argentina. But under pressure from the United States, the government of Brazil and Argentina capitulated, and President Jose Lopez Portillo, the President of Mexico, was left, shall we say, hanging out to dry. As a result, in October of 1982, he capitulated to the terms which were delivered to his government and people around him by people such as Henry A. Kissinger, who made a trip to Mexico at that time to attempt to intimidate the Mexicans to submitting to these new terms. This was one issue between me and Kissinger and his friends. The second issue was that sometime about December of 1981, a representative of the U.S. government approached me and had asked me if I would be willing to set up an exploratory back-channel discussion with the Soviet government, because the Soviet government wanted, according to them, an additional channel to discuss things. And I said didn't reject the idea. I said, but I have an idea on this question of nuclear missile. It was becoming increasingly dangerous, forward basing, more precise missiles, electromagnetic pulse. We're getting toward a first strike. It would be very useful to discuss what I proposed in my 1980 election campaign with the Soviet government to see if they'd be interested in discussing such a proposal. This might prove a profitable exploratory discussion. And so from February of 1982 through February 1982, I did conduct such back-channel discussions with representatives of the Soviet government in Washington, D.C. Those were somewhat fruitful, but ultimately abortive. Kissinger and others became aware of this discussion during the summer of 1982, and their circles were very much opposed to that. The general view was expressed, but that I was getting too big for my britches, and I had to be dealt with. On the question of debt, which some of these people were concerned about, and on this question of strategic missile defense, which I had this proposal, which the President adopted, at least initially, in the form of what became known as the Strategic Defense Initiative. And when the Strategic Defense Initiative was announced by the President on March 23rd, 1983, there were a lot of people out for my scalp. Those are the at least contributing factors in what happened to me. But they may not be all. There probably are others as well. What I find significant, and I found significant in this case, is that the problem here, even though Kissinger may have been largely the author or the agent of the authors in bringing about the what I would characterize as a fraudulent indictment and conviction, that the problem here is that, and I saw this from being in prison, where people would come to me with their paperwork and talk to me about their cases, prisoners, which made a stronger impression on me on this question, that we have, in my view, a system of injustice whose center is within the Department of Justice, especially the criminal division of the U.S. Department of Justice. The problem lies not with one administration or another, though one administration or another may act more positively or more negatively. You have permanent civil service employees, like Deputy Assistant Attorneys General Jack Keeney and Mark Richard, who are coordinators of a nest of institutions in the criminal division, which show up repeatedly as leading or key associates of every legal atrocity which I've seen. This is the case with the so-called Frühmenschen operation, which is largely an FBI operation, but cannot run without cooperation from these people and their assistants. The case of the demoniac case, which is outstanding, of a man who they, according to the Sixth Circuit, a man who the Justice Department knew to be innocent of the charges they were making against him at the time they made the charges. And yet Mark Richard and Jack Keeney and so forth proceeded with that case, an attempt to secure the execution of this man in Israel over the objections of the Israeli government for an OSI operation which was set into place by Henry Kissinger some years before. You have the case of the Weaver case, the same thing. The much celebrated case of the Waco case, the same complex of injustice. We have an out-of-control Justice Department, in my view, where the rot is not in the appointees as much as it is in the permanent bureaucracy. We have a permanent sickness in the permanent bureaucracy of part of our government. In my case, when the time came that somebody wanted me out of the way, they were able to rely upon that permanent injustice in the permanent bureaucracy of government to do the job. As in the Frühmenschen case, the Weaver case, the Waco case, the case of Waldheim, the case of Demoniac, in other cases, always there's that agency inside the Justice Department which works for contract like a hitman when somebody with the right credentials and passwords walks in and says, we want to get this group of people or we want to get this person. My case may be, as Ramsey Clark described it, the most extensive and the highest level of these cases in terms of the duration and scope of the operation, which came to involve the Soviet government. It came to involve the East German Stasi intelligence service. It involves collaboration between the Department of Justice and the Stasi in the case of Palmer's murder case. It involved direct collaboration between, as I say, the Soviet government, the Soviet press, particularly from about off and on Andropov beginning the 1984. And then when Gorbachev came in again, 85 to 86 into 88, the Soviet press vilification of me in collaboration with the same line as the US press exceeded that of anything since Stalin's time in the Soviet press against any private individual in history. And it was part of the same operation. So my case is important in the sense it's more extensive, it's more deep-going, long-going. But when it came to getting me, it was the same apparatus that I find, in my opinion, was used in these other cases. And that until we remove from our system of government a rotten, permanent bureaucracy which acts like contract assassins, using the authority of the justice system to perpetrate assassination, this country is not free, nor anyone in it.
My life has been definitely marked and changed by the injustice which hit us, and I'm in the business of fighting to undo it really since 1987, when the first indictments against my husband came. He was called a criminal, a fraud person, and similar things. And I was so upset about this that I decided that the most beautiful human being I know on this planet, who has devoted his entire life to undo the injustice globally, could not be slandered. When Lynn was put in prison, we kept mobilizing the entire time to free him, because it was very clear that giving him the sentence of 15 years was meant to be a death sentence and that he was not supposed to come alive out of prison. Now, we did lobbying. We had altogether, I would say, 800 elected officials around the world, about 3,000 VIPs, among them former heads of government, who eventually all lobbied for him, wrote letters to President Clinton, to the different committees in the Senate. And I want to report to you a transformation process, because in the beginning, those members of Congress in the Black Caucus, in the other caucuses, they would somehow listen, but they would have mixed minds. And when we finally succeeded to get Lynn free about 1.5 years ago, we kept this effort going and said that we need the full exoneration because Lynn's name must be cleared so that he can do the political task he has to do. And the recent experience with these activities, and we had people from the Duma in Russia, from the Ukrainian parliament, from Africa, from the Middle East, from Latin America, we have found that the Congress, there is not one person anymore who does not privately agree that this is a completely political case and that this is the biggest frame-up. And we had several congressmen who said, yes, I would do it, but give me one other congressman, and then we do it together. Or people saying, you're absolutely right, but we need a little bit more courage here. So I want to point to one other aspect for your consideration of why we must win. The most important in history is ideas, especially those ideas which move mankind forward, which are ideas which make the life of generations to come more human. And you can see it in those states which are governed by racism, like I saw it just in Alabama, where I thought Selma would be full of monuments for Martin Luther King, and I mean I was really totally shocked to see that the opposite was true. You see, when the absence of ideas is the case, like the absence of civil rights, the absence of human rights, how much misery that does to the people. So, for me, the biggest crime, what happened to my husband, is not that he was innocently in jail. And, I'm not saying it was not a hard time, because it was. And, I mean, I can only say that, people should feel the heart pain of what also Patricia Morris expressed, that this is done to real human beings. It's not just some figures and statistics. People suffer. Their whole lives are being destroyed. But the lack of the ability to have important ideas govern history, that is the biggest crime. And Lynn, while he was incredibly courageous of producing creative work when he was in prison, I mean, he did more in prison than any of us outside, and he put us to shame. But nevertheless, I will only give you one example. In 1989, he was already in jail for nearly 1 year when the borders of Europe opened. He, from his prison cell, designed a great vision how to integrate Eastern Europe, Western Europe, China, the whole Eurasian continent, which would have been a groundbreaking conception which would have put the entire history of the 20th century on a totally new basis, because economically to integrate that economic space as one would have given opportunities and freedom to the states of the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe and the Asian countries. And he designed such a plan which we presented and which now in the meantime is practically as an alternative on the table in Russia, in Ukraine, in the European Union. But because Lynn was in jail, this idea did not become as effective as if he would have been free. Now, I'm saying this because, to put a man of great ideas into jail is a crime all by itself because of the ideas. The reason why we were able to mobilize hundreds of parliamentarians and thousands of VIPs from around the globe, why would people from Africa sign the parole request for Lyndon LaRouche? Why would people from Latin America do this? Why would people from around the world, from Russia, why would people come out of completely different cultural worlds to fight for this man? Well, because we not only said this man must be free and his innocence must be proven, but many of them told me and others that they understand that the kind of change in global policy my husband is standing for, the kind of just new world economic order which allows the economic development of Africa, which allows the economic development of the developing countries of Eastern Europe, they say is the only hope for them, for their nation, as far away as it may be. So the reason why we must win is not, not because it's a personal affair. But as my husband was saying, we are going into a period of crisis which most people are completely unaware of. The kinds of changes have to be big, and they have to be done with the help of the United States, because the world cannot be saved against the United States. If you have a fascist president in the United States from '96 onward, my hopes that the rest of the world will make it are very slim.
Anyone?
No, go ahead. How would you propose to deal with a permanent bureaucracy that's protected by civil service laws, cowardly politicians, people with power? How do you get at that?
I think it can be done. I'm not pessimistic, though I'm very cautious about this. It's very dangerous. In my view, we're living in very dangerous times. In my view, the global monetary and financial system as it now exists is going to collapse. The only thing that can prevent a collapse is government action to put it through the equivalent of what we call Chapter 11 bankruptcy. These are dangerous times. We see what in the Congress, for example, the contract on America or with America. This is the kind of stuff of which Nazi concentration camps are made, death camps are made. You declare some people unwed mothers, useless eaters, or their children. You take people who are in categories such as senior citizens. And we saw in Chicago with people dying in a heat wave because of a breakdown in the infrastructure. There was no electricity to run their air conditioning. And people of hypothermia dying because as you get more advanced years, your resistance, except for some tough ladies I met in Alabama of 100 years of age, but you become weakened and you die. If you withhold necessary medical care, you die. If you withhold, you say, well, that medical procedure, that test is very good, but we think it's not cost-benefit wise. And therefore someone dies of cancer because of the precautionary test, say, for prostate cancer. And I've seen some cases of this recently in my personal periphery. The relevant test was not made because some physician who had been brainwashed by our present policy said, in cost-benefit terms, that procedure is available. We don't think it's wise. It jacks up the insurance rates if too many people use it. And yet that test is essential to have someone act on a prostate cancer sometimes between the time of its onset and the time it becomes virtually uncontrollable. So if we remove tests, if we remove adequate medical care, if we remove public assistance for people who are desperate, we have, in a sense, with a pencil, done the same thing as if we killed the same number of people with an axe.
You know, you and I had a little chat in Selma, Alabama, and you were saying to me that, well, I had raised to you about affirmative action. And I think your phrase was that it was a red herring. And I didn't get a chance to say to you that it is a red herring, but whole states are buying it. And for a little black fella sitting off 20% of the population, this government has not been in touch with me since Lyndon Johnson said he wouldn't run again, and I had a lot of reservations about him. But sitting back as a little black fella, and I see entire states marching in lockstep and accepting this red herring as gospel, I guess you can understand that even somebody like me sometimes feel overwhelmed. And whether or not America is just a lost cause. I hate to sound that way, but after 40 years, I got serious reservations about whether we can save this country, about whether this country even wants to be saved.
Well, I take an evangelical view of this. I've been associated with many lost causes in my life, as you have.
Yeah.
And once in a while we win them. Our job is not affirmative action to share out the shrinking number of jobs available. Our job is to create the jobs and to create at the same time the matching educational facilities and the support programs which turn the unemployed, who are not taxpayers because they don't have any income to be part of the tax revenue base, to become a contributing member of society and a part of the tax revenue base. And there's nothing that stops us except crazy ideology from following our Constitution and its original intent and doing just that, as Lincoln did. We can do it again. There's no need for somebody begging out in the street to get somebody else's job. There's a lot of work to be done. You just look at the Tom Bigby project and what should have been done to complete that. That'll keep people busy for a long time. You take the American water system. Our aquifers are turning into sewers when they're not going dry because we're not building a water project, which we need. We don't have enough power. We have 20%. When we came out of World War II, there were 60% of us in the labor force were producing material goods. Today, less than 20%. We have coupon clippers, we have unemployed, we have people in prison, but 20% are producing. Our standard of living in the United States today, in physical terms, if you include healthcare, education, science and technology, plus the things you physically consume, we're half of what we were 25 years ago. We're about that in productivity. This nation is going down the sewer. The world's going down the sewer. We have the means, and government has the means, to turn it around. When enough people in this country stand up on their hind legs and stop voting for what they don't want, or for a result they don't want. And I think that if the problem with people, as I see it, is people don't trust the leadership, and I don't blame them for not trusting their leadership. I blame them for being too pessimistic. And it's up to us and others to get enough people moving to create a movement. Like the case just of Martin Luther King. Now, I never personally met Martin Luther King, but I watched him closely. And I know something about Martin Luther King from people who knew him and his circumstances. And here's a man who's a good man, he's a preacher, Baptist preacher, I don't know. They run to this way and that way. But one day somebody appointed him, nominated him to be a leader of the civil rights movement, out of a crowd, so to speak. He took the job as an appointee, like a federal appointee, only this was the civil rights movement. He went from crisis to crisis in a few years from the time that he received that appointment until he went to his death, knowing he was facing death. And in that period of time, he made a number of public speeches of great power and pith. Each of those speeches corresponded to a point of crisis in the history of the civil rights movement. And I saw on television, and I read in the recorded speeches, I read a man who had gone into private, into his own Gethsemane, probably inspired by reading the New Testament, and said, I will drink of this cup. And he came out with an idea, with a lot of people swarming around him. But he came out with the idea, and he presented a concept which took a whole people who were looking to him in the civil rights movement, and he ennobled them. He said, you're not fighting for African American rights, you're fighting for everybody's rights. You're fighting to make the Constitution real. And it was a new idea, a different idea. And as he did with his mountain speech that he gave just before he went, again, a man who had walked into Gethsemane and said, yes, Lord, I will drink of this cup as my Savior before me. And he went out and he drank of the cup, and he inspired people. Now, we don't know who among us is going to be the great leader of this period. But we know, as the civil rights people of the 1960s who had been at the civil rights business for many centuries, in point of fact, many of them of the conscious family tradition, they assembled together. They picked people from their midst as leaders. And among these leaders was Martin Luther King. And I think if enough of us assemble today around these kinds of issues and show the nation that there is something moving, something which is of concern to the average citizen, that from among those we gather, together for that purpose, we will find the leaders we need.
We've asked the Department of Justice for a comprehensive review. Lyndon LaRouche always asked for a review not only of his case, but of all cases where there are allegations of serious misconduct, and usually names a bunch of them. And so we've always done that. That's his vision. It happens to be my vision, too, of how you correct things. But the capacity of the Department of Justice for self-criticism is of a very low order. The media is a great problem. The media is controlled by wealth and power that prefers the status quo, and it's very sophisticated in how it manages these matters. I can take a cause that they're interested in that's virtually meaningless and be on primetime evening news. And I can take on a cause of what I consider to be international importance of the highest magnitude that they oppose and shout from the rooftops, and you'd never know I existed. That's the way it works. I think we'll get our hearing in time, and I think it'll be a reasonably short time, but I think it's going to be meaningful. It's going to take a regeneration of moral force in the American people. I'm both an optimist and an idealist, so you have to take what I say with a grain of salt. But I believe that the civil rights movement was the noblest quest of the American people in my time. I think it was real and vital and passionate, and I think it consumed the energies and faith of some few millions of people. I mean, we really believed in it. We were marching and singing and doing. We have to have a moral regeneration and energy and commitment and faith and belief that we can overcome, that equality is desirable, that justice is essential, that a life of principle is the only life worth living. And then we'll get our hearings. Then we won't need our hearings, but we'll have to keep on.
Behavior and the unconstitutional activities undertaken directed out of the criminal division of the Department of Justice is to show you their own documents and read to you their own words. And by way of history, I'd like to have the screen. You see before you is an FBI memorandum from the SAC, who is the special agent in charge of the New York field office of the FBI, to the director regarding, and the name subject, Lyndon Hermile LaRouche Jr., also known as Lynn Marcus, as they suggest. This is the most incredible piece of FBI material, one of the most incredible pieces of FBI material that I've ever seen. And CPUSA name. We're Communist Party. I'm going to get it. That's the Communist Party of the United States. What this suggests is that the Communist Party has let the FBI know that they want to eliminate Lyndon LaRouche. for their political reasons. They consider him to be a politically dangerous person, and the Communist Party wants to eliminate him. If you look at the bottom, New York proposes submitting a blind memorandum to the Daily World to foster these efforts. Here's the FBI climbing in bed with the Communist Party in order to effect the elimination of Lyndon LaRouche from the political scene. I think we all know what that means. So moving into the 80s, Henry Kissinger, who we all know by name and some probably remember by reputation and actions, was a very powerful man. Mr. LaRouche took exception with his policies, which he considered to be genocidal.
It was the American Dreyfus, which included testimony from attorney Odin Anderson, LaRouche himself, and former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark. The Demjanjuk case was detailed by his Israeli attorney, Yoram Sheftel, who risked his own life to save his client from the hangman. And Dr. Hans Köchler, president of the International Progress Organization, described how former UN General Secretary Kurt Waldheim, when he became president of Austria, also became a target of a corrupt unit within the U.S. Department of Justice. The hearings were chaired by former South Carolina Congressman James Mann and by Alabama's most renowned civil rights attorney, J.L. Chestnut.
This is an independent panel of my distinguished colleagues from all over this country who have come to this place at this time to investigate allegations of misconduct by the United States Department of Justice generally, and in particular their targeting of black elected officials.
As we attempt to study the broad subject of misconduct by the Department of Justice, and we look at Ruby Ridge, and we look at Waco, and we look at Demjanjuk, and others of lesser notoriety, we cannot overlook the one that is perhaps the most pervasive, and I'm stealing the word from Ramsey Clark, I think, most pervasive course of misconduct by the Department of Justice in the history of this country. Broader-based, long-standing, abuse of power beyond expression. Abuse of power through the use of federal agencies, including even the bankruptcy court. Throughout the days of the LaRouche ordeal, Odin Anderson, a lawyer from Boston, has been the solid rock of criminal defense and counsel, far and above any other person. He can therefore speak to the subject of misconduct or such facets of that as he may choose to discuss better than anybody. And we appreciate him taking the time to be here from Boston to make some such statement as he wishes to make and be responsive to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Congressman, honorable panel. It's I who thank you for this opportunity to speak about the LaRouche case. Probably the best way to demonstrate the government's
I want you all to know that whatever and whenever these proceedings generate, it is something that has never been done before to tell the story of the African American and certainly the African American politician. Those of us who have sacrificed our families, our professions, and even our lives to help bring about a better way of life in America.
I don't know how you feel about all this story.
Fourth case I submit to you, panelists, will be an essay on prosecutorial misconduct. And I think it's bound to become one of the most egregious cases in the harassment and abuse of a black elected official in the history of the United States Justice Department.
And that until we remove from our system of government a rotten, permanent bureaucracy which acts like contract assassins, using the authority of the justice system to perpetrate assassination, this country is not free, nor anyone in it.
Good that it was brought up. I mean, we can see that in this case, in the case of the Mianyuk, the KGB people were much fairer than the Justice Department. Really, because, and I'll tell you why.
Are you saying to us that one government, the United States, declared the president, the head of state of another government, to be a war criminal, and the second government, through official sources, asked the United States government for clarification and the basis on which it reached that conclusion, and the United States government refused to provide that information?
On August 31st and September 1st, 1995, a distinguished panel of American legislators and international observers held extraordinary hearings to investigate the Justice Department's politically motivated and illegal targeting of groups and individuals. The panel included Representative William Clark of Alabama, Representative Toby Fitch of North Carolina, Senator Robert Ford of South Carolina, Senator Maggie Wallace Glover of South Carolina, Monsignor Elias L. Hayek of Montreal, Representative John Hilliard of Alabama, Representative Howard Hunter of North Carolina, Representative Ulysses Jones Jr. of Tennessee, and Representative Percy Watson of Mississippi. The hearings were observed by Dr. Kofi Awanor, former ambassador to the United Nations of the Republic of Ghana, Marino El Savif of the Dominican Republic, Dr. Josef Mikloshko, former vice premier of the Republic of Czechoslovakia, and noted civil rights leader Amelia Boynton Robinson. The first day's sessions were largely devoted to one of the ugliest stories in U.S. judicial history, the campaign to harass, entrap, and prosecute every African-American elected official in America. This was followed by the case of Lyndon LaRouche, often referred to